So we good to go? All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China in the World program here at Columbia University. We have a special guest here today, an old friend of the program, Isaac Kardon. Isaac Kardon is a senior fellow of China Studies at the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment. That's his new job. He'd worked for several years as an assistant professor at the U.S. Naval War College and the China Maritime Studies Institute there, where he researched China's maritime affairs, and he taught mid-career naval officers on their way up to admiral and national security professionals about PRC foreign policy and security policy. His research has centered on the development of maritime power in China, which is really something that started in the 1990s. It's a relatively recent phenomenon. And he has a new book, which I had the pleasure of reading the draft manuscript of, China's Law of the Sea, The New Rules of Maritime Order, at Yale Press 2023. And that's the cover, right?
That's it.
Wow. All right.
Almost had.
I haven't seen it.
I haven't seen a physical hard copy either.
Yeah, okay.
Daniel almost worked a miracle, and maybe it'll still come through.
So I won't feel slighted. I haven't seen the real thing yet, but there it is. It's beautiful. And
It was originally all red. I had to fight for that blue.
no, you have to have
Got
some
it
blue.
balanced.
Yeah. So the most important part of Isaac's impressive CV is that he was a China in the World postdoctoral fellow from 2016 to 2017. So he's part of our crew forever. That's how our program rolls. And he's held various other appointments, visiting appointment at NYU School of Law, Academia Sinica in Taiwan, and the PRC National Institute for South China Sea Studies. There aren't that many people who have held positions on both sides of the straits doing these things. And he has a PhD from my first employer, Cornell University, where I taught in the government department, and an MPhil in modern Chinese studies from Oxford University. And he also has a BA from Dartmouth College. He's our old friend. He knows a lot about China's naval strategy and about China's claims in the South China Sea, the East China Sea. He knows a lot about cross-strait relations, so it should be really fun to engage with him today. So welcome home to our program, and it's great to have you back.
Thank you, Tom. That's a really wonderful introduction. Should I be speaking into that?
Take
Okay. We sound good? Got it. Okay. I don't want to speak too close to it. Well, I'm so glad to be part of this CWP crew, and it's great to meet the new crop of fellows, and we'll have a whole bunch more to talk about next week. But for this week, I'm really happy to be back giving this a presentation on this particular book, because of course my time at CWP was focused on developing really the foundations of this book, which came from raising my dissertation and starting from scratch in a new Word document.
But you reminded me of something important. Let me cut you off just for a
Sure.
second. Our China in the World annual conference is next week. I will be remiss on Monday, the 27th of February, right here in the International Affairs Building on the 15th floor. And you can sign up at the China in the World website to attend in person. And please do so. And I was really remiss to leave that out, but you reminded me by saying we're going to see everyone next week. So go ahead.
Good. And this very much is a product of my experience in the CWP community, which is for a lifetime. As Tom said, he read a draft manuscript of this. Other people have read parts of it. Professor Ian Johnston read closely and gave great comments during our conference way back when, before the new era in U.S.-China relations. And yeah, it's just a real delight and an honor to be back here. So this book is sketched out here, and I trust people online can see this this table of contents, which is from the book that I've yet to lay hands on, but I'm told it exists and will be in libraries and bookstores very soon. But I tried to make the title fairly descriptive as to what I was trying to accomplish. And if I had a little bit more space on the cover, I would have elaborated a bit to say that it's China's practice of the law of the sea, China's interpretations of the law of the sea. It's the ways that China thinks of the law of the sea in its foreign policy, suppose you could say. And so inevitably in circling around these questions about law and international law and China's maritime disputes, which is what I would say is the basic subject of this, I started trying to figure out over the course of a doctoral process, a postdoctoral process, and then some time working for the US Navy at the Naval War College, engaging with a lot of people involved in some of the practice of the law of the sea from the US Navy side, as well as our counterparts in China. As Tom mentioned, I spent a bunch of time in Hainan, working with people who are part of the Hainan government and connected to the central government in Beijing, thinking about China's maritime claims, and especially its disputed maritime claims. And it's worth noting, and we can go into as much detail as people want to in Q&A, but I'm going to sort of assume a reasonably high level of knowledge of the fact of China's many maritime disputes. I guess it's worth emphasizing they have no settled maritime boundaries with any of their neighbors. There's a partial maritime boundary resolved with Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin, but other than that, there are no agreed boundaries, and we'll get into what China's views on what those boundaries should be are. But ultimately, what we have is a really clear instance where China has some strong views on what I'm calling the rules, and using the title as the rules. And this is sort of the way I frame the study. And my question is not so much, what are the rules, or who's winning in some epical struggle to remake the rules-based international order, whatever that is. I actually heard it for the first time acronymized at CWP in 2017 by Admiral Harry Harris in his brief. And it's always stuck with me. RBIO he used then, and I think I've seen other versions of it. I have a picture of it somewhere, but that's sort of been the framing for me. And I've ended up becoming very literal minded about it. And that's reflected in the book. What are the rules? If there is a rules-based international order, if rules are being broken, changed, remade, I want to be a little concrete about it. And I ended up being, I think, very, very thorough, almost to a fault. And I won't fault anyone for not wanting to read every single unpacking of rules and China's views on those rules. And it's formal practice. It's domestic law, it's rules, it's regulations, it's statements to the United Nations, and importantly, as I'll get into, it's physical practice on the water. It's manifestation of what it is that it prefers for the rules or the norms to be. I pulled out a couple representative, and we could have pulled a number of other quotations from the US side, which I think is intentional. We're going to get into a lot from the Chinese side, but ultimately the framing here is, if it is the case that the rules-based order is under threat in some way, under siege, let's talk about what these rules are and how would we know if the rules were changing. And that's kind of the direction I traveled with this. And actually, Daniel, I should ask sooner, how long do you want me to track on the talk, and how long do you want to discuss?
40 minutes.
Okay, give me like a 5-minute warning. So I'm just going to walk through in these 35, 40 minutes, what I try and do in the book in sequence, and then hopefully leave a bunch of space for a broader discussion. I'm very interested to hear what Tom has to say about it, and your questions as well. So I'll try and stay well within it. Please keep me to that. So again, the basic question that I'm trying to get at is, if China's making the rules, changing the rules, breaking the rules, we'll get into what we mean by those things. What are those rules? How would we know if they did? How would we, measure it in a reasonable way? And then what are the implications of that is something we'll get into. But ultimately, we see from a framing standpoint, from a context standpoint, this is something that the United States, and I'll go back to this Harris slide quickly. It's remarkable that the operational head of the main warfighting organization in the United States Armed Forces thinks about his job as fighting against China undermining a rules-based order, a very abstract at a minimum, very difficult to conceptualize or measure or fight to defend or operationalize from a Navy commander's standpoint. It's a very abstract, weird thing to be talking about. And I tried to kind of make it as concrete as I possibly could. And one of the ways I did that is just sort of situating what's the scope of what we're talking about here. And forgive me if it's a little bit confusing, but ultimately that's one thing that I will hopefully simplify a bit for you. But the law of the sea is famously, even for international law, it's famously very, very it's elaborate and baroque and has a lot of nooks and crannies and very, very, very lot of black letter rules, a lot of very fine grained distinctions between different types of things. It's legalistic that way, but to an extreme. And so it's a piece of this overall order, ultimately, is what I'm trying to illustrate here. You could think of as Professor Ian Johnston has, a world of orders, and that's been a very influential framing on me. He gave that a primordial version of that talk here at Columbia for a CWP talk, I believe. And it's really shaped the way I've thought about this analytically, which is that it's not really coherent to think about an RBIO that really doesn't compute for any real practical purposes, frankly. But there are some distinct orders, and they have relationships, and this is my best stab at trying to identify what this is. And we're talking about a maritime order, by which I mean something that's familiar to students of security studies. Basically, this is the ordering principles, as I think about it, it's a tension between free seas, free projection of power for those navies or those maritime powers that can, but also balanced out by some sense of the need for maritime commerce and trade. All these things are not that regulated by international law per se, but they're part of an overall order. The law of the sea is one of the oldest bodies of international law, and it came about precisely to regulate some of these interactions among sea powers who have interests that are sometimes in conflict. And that's primarily a body of customary law. It's been evolving, arguably codified since the Roman era, and we are seeing the continuation of this long-standing accumulation of custom, which is basically the practice of states, and also states' belief that practice is somehow lawful. We'll get a little bit into the doctrine, not too much for reasons that I'll get into. What I try to do to think about rule change is not, come to a ruling like an arbitrator would come to a ruling on a question about international law. We've seen that. I spent a lot of time in China during the South China Sea arbitration, as we call it, the Philippines suit against China under the law of the sea, and was very much involved in how the Chinese legal community and their sort of diplomatic community, thought about that. And they have some particular views about the rules, which we'll get into. But what my interest is in terms of setting out to study this question is not to say, oh, China has formed this rule and I can prove it with this empirical evidence, or they've failed to create a rule here. The rule is actually that. There's really nobody that can rule on what the rule is other than a court. And that's an institutional fact as opposed to an empirical question. It's not something that you can really adjudicate. And certainly no one cares what someone with a social science and sinology background has to say about this. There's a whole institutional structure that decides questions like this. But one thing you can do once you start reading the discussion in that international law community is understand that the creation of new law, especially the creation of new customary law, which is basically behavior of states at its core, is a very contentious subject. It kind of confounds some of the analytic machinery of international law. And I think we can bring some very helpful insights from Chinese foreign policy, from international relations, from the disciplines meeting up and finding what I view as basically threshold, minimum conditions. If China were making the rules, what would any court, any lawyer need to see? And what you'd need to see are things that are actually quite intuitive and straightforward. Virtually uniform and basically consistent over time. This is language that's threaded through basically every discussion in jurisprudence as well as in international legal academy about these questions. And they're not that controversial and they're highly subjective. That's the way that these decisions function, is that judges are going to take stock of facts based on some rough guiding principles about you need to have uniformity. If it's going to be a rule, this is all logical. If I do one thing here and one thing there, and there's no rhyme or reason to the differences between, say, the southern part of the South China Sea and the northern part of the South China Sea. But I'm saying there's a rule for all of these. That's not a coherent rule. Similarly, if it changes what you say the rule is over time, it's very difficult to think of those as rule, creating just the necessary conditions for something to be recognized as a rule. Again, from a legal standpoint, we're going to talk about at the end what it looks like from a broader kind of ordering or security standpoint. But basically, this analysis, I think, and we can talk more about the theory if folks want to go there, but basically, I'm not trying to make some particularly ambitious theoretical claim other than that basically any way of thinking about US-China relations or China's security environment is going to involve some questions about the rules. If you think of rules as being really independently important, you have kind of a bottom-up view. The order, such as it is, will reflect kind of the constitution, the building up, the aggregation of different rules, and like that's what an order is from one theoretical standpoint. Alternatively, it's very top-down. This would be like the arch realist version, just to say it starkly, is that the great powers or the hegemonic power sets the rules in the system. And so the rules are of interest, regardless of where you are. And there really aren't any useful theoretical apparatus, even the very spare realists in IR or in public international law theory, who don't postulate, the rules are going to play some important coordinating function for everyone. And so I've sort of kind of landed on them as a lowest common denominator. Most of the book, as you'll see, is going to go through them.
Just have one question about that.
Yeah, sure.
It's the upper left and the bottom left at the top are the same, virtually uniform and
Yes.
consistent practice. Why is one treaty law and one's customary law?
So thinking about the different possible pathways of rule change, you could consider that China could change the rule as codified in the law of the sea. There's a formal mechanism for that.
That's the or one.
That's right. That's or, but it can actually be that states practicing within the treaty at a widespread and representative level, if they all interpret it. So for example, if all states thought, as China does, that you need to have permission from a coastal state
Okay.
for a warship to travel.
So I asked this
through.
for a reason because
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
supposed to debate this at the University of
Yes.
Toronto online. And what I'm going to say is that top thing is called breaking the rules. But
Okay.
yeah,
It could be. No, and that's actually
this is
what,
interesting, breaking the rules and writing new rules. And that's
and-
probably where we differ.
yes, and actually,
We're both concerned about the behavior, but we see
yes. And I guess I'm glad that you said that, these distinctions between breaking, making, shaping, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there are lots of valid ways to think about it. Ultimately, I'm not working on this question of is China breaking the rules or is China complying with the rules, or this whole kind of package of questions about what would create conditions for compliance.
Yeah, I don't want to knock you off.
Yeah,
the
yeah.
track
No, okay.
Because we'll talk about in the Q&A. That'll be
Okay.
my first question.
Okay, well, let me keep moving forward, and I'm just going to walk through the book quickly. How many minutes do I have here, Daniel, for this? Okay. Another 10, you say? 25. Got it. So, excuse me. Before going into all the specific rule sets, that's basically how I organized it. The treaty organizes things in certain ways. China organizes in certain ways in its own domestic law. I organize it in a way that I think analytically makes sense that I will walk you through. But before going there, you kind of need some sense of what's the organizational and indeed ideological logic of China's engagement with international law, and how does that relate to some of its interests in maritime rights and interests, as they say, and maritime power. And so what this chapter does is kind of sets a bit of a historical baseline. I don't think those Chinese diplomats are laughing at the treaty written down, but in a way, in 1971, when China showed up, the People's Republic of China showed up at in Geneva or wherever they first went, in New York to the UN. I
They
should know
were
that.
new
better.
members of the UN. Yeah,
That's right.
September 1971.
That's right. And the first really, really big item on the agenda, it was then called the Seabed Committee. But this was the central cause, or one of the kind of the key galvanizing causes for the formation of the G77 grouping, or this third world or developing world coalition that Mao very much thought of himself as the leader of, and as the developer of that conceptual apparatus to begin with, or its popularizer. But of course, in 1971, when China showed up at the United Nations in the China seat that had been unceremoniously vacated by their predecessors, they didn't have anybody who was trained in the law of the sea as a practical matter. Law schools had been closed in China for the last 4 or 5 years. The profession had been entirely defenestrated, in some cases, literally. And there's some really interesting memoirs that are part of this study of some of the diplomats who participated. Ling Qing, in particular, has some very, very detailed comments about the law of the sea. And one thing that he articulates very clearly, and that's confirmed by, among other things, my discussions with people who are involved in the negotiations, is China was not all that interested in the substance of the treaty that they were negotiating. The treaty negotiations went on from 73 to 82. They were interested, but they could live with a lot of different outcomes so long as the G77 or the third world or whoever it was voted en masse in a bloc against the interests of the Americans and the Soviets. which was one of these really unusual conditions here. This treaty basically just restricts maritime powers from expressing their full power in naval affairs, in resource exploitation, in surveillance, in any number of other categories. And it really is a reflection of what Steve Krasner called this. It was like the reaction to liberalism, or the rise of the rest against the first world. This is a real third world watershed. And so China was very committed ideologically and politically to the treaty. People like Ling Qing, who was a diplomat and a lawyer by temperament, if not by training, understood that they had signed up for a disadvantageous deal for China. And we'll see why in the maps that are coming forward here. But basically, because China has this first island chain, because it only has one coast exposed to open ocean, in a geographically defined system, as the law of the sea is, that's extending state jurisdiction radically, which is what's going on here in the 70s and 80s. China is getting almost nothing. And you see their complaints if you read the contemporaneous discussion. Japan in particular, may as well go to the map just to visualize it. Japan in particular has totally unimpeded oceanic access. The United States, the French, the British, everybody with islands out in the middle of nowhere. China has this deeply, deeply landlocked, or rather zone locked is the word for it under the law of the sea, maritime configuration on its coast. And that didn't really enter into China's substantive bargaining positions because, for one, their attitude towards international treaties was basically, this is a joke. They don't have any instrumentation in their own domestic law or policy for dealing with the treaty such that it would bind them to do one thing and not do another. They don't think it's entirely a joke, of course. They're investing quite a lot of time and effort in it, but it's a political instrument. It's a useful thing for them to do, and it fits into a broader foreign policy agenda. And I think that context is really important for understanding what I do here is just sort of lay out the development of China's law of the sea, as in the organizational and in some cases sort of resources, physical capacity, ships, people, the fisheries law enforcement capacity, the remote sensing capacity, all these different things are kind of built under this header of China is in a politically competitive environment in the maritime space. The law of the sea is one of the many fronts of this struggle. And that's the way that it's basically conceptualized when you look at the approach that China took in the 70s. And ironically, I don't think this is a story of like radical change over time in that attitude. It's quite instrumental today. And I hope this is controversial and draws Tom out a bit, but there's really not a lot about the lawness of any treaty in a way for China that makes it really important. In their own domestic law, they talk about international law, international treaties, and other important agreements. Tom will know well that they often talk of the three communiques as though those are treaties because they're other important agreements. They think it's the same thing. Treaties can capture very high levels of political commitment, and they can be very costly. And I'm not arguing that China thinks that they're entirely a joke, so much as China believes that they're mutable. They do not believe that the black letters written in the treaty are impervious to different interpretations. And in fact, we see that, and this is one of my real interests in giving the talk here and talking to people like you, is extensions into other domains. To what extent can we think about China's approach to the law of the sea as being something that tells us something broader about how they're going to approach, or how they do, in fact, empirically approach other domains, other bodies of rules, rule sets, as Harris would have called it. So I won't go into a lot of detail on these empirical chapters. I may even just kind of summarize them very quickly and go back if we want to talk about the particular rules, because we really are in the eaches, as they say, in the very particular rules here. And what I've tried to do with this map commissioned on my very meager advance from the Yale University Press, but which captures some important things, which is basically, if we project what China is saying its rules are, as best as I can infer it from what I will submit to you as a very complex and in some ways incoherent set of formal practices that China has put into place on this subject. This is more or less what they're saying. They're saying islands, and here we're talking about geographic rules. This is a very important set of rules, has to do with where do you draw the lines around your country to project zones? How far do those zones go? And what do you do when another person's zone overlaps your zone? That's this rule set. They're scattered across the treaty as well as customary law. And again, I'm trying to look at both of those places where you might sea change. China's law of the sea, such as it is here, obviously you can look at this in close detail if you want and zone out whatever I'm saying. And hopefully you can make some inferences from it. But basically, they draw lines around all these very scattered, in some cases, non-islands, things that from conventional interpretation of the law of the sea shouldn't have any maritime rights associated with them. They project the full extent of any possible zone from all of those baselines. And so this chapter looks at first entitlements, baselines, and boundaries. And I basically go through, and let me actually back up for a second so you see the sequence. The first necessary condition, and I skipped this before, the first necessary condition is China's practice needs to meet some basic necessary threshold. Could you even recognize a rule? Just giving them the benefit of the doubt in every possible way. Is this something that they said, here's what you should do under situation X to draw, to get entitlements from maritime features? Then I asked whether it was consistent over time, and this is mining all the records. PKU law database, really super useful resource for CWP folks and other researchers. Very, very detailed down to the department level, down to the provincial levels and county level stuff sometimes. Excuse me. But then, even if, as you see, they sometimes capture some of these categories, and these are my codings, we can have discussions about it, but I think they're reasonable. Then another necessary condition is it's not a rule if it's just you doing it. Again, logically, but this is captured in law. And so I ended up for the first time, and this was not my dissertation or the original discussion, saying, who are the other states whose practice counts here? And fortunately, international law is a very clear way of understanding this. It's specially affected states. It's not a lot of controversy about this. Rules matter more for states that are affected by them. And in the law of the sea case, it's almost all geographic. It's quite obvious who matters. It's all the neighbors who don't have maritime boundaries with China and who claim resources that China also claims, basically. Claim islands, sovereignty over islands that China also claims. That's the core of the reason you have these maritime disputes to begin with. And so this is what I do for each of the rule sets, as you might think of them, because they are kind of clusters. We move on to resource rules, which is to say who owns all these resources. And the maps change variously, and you can see things like, here's where China put some contract bids out for oil blocks in the southwestern part. I'm trying to capture the formal bits of practice that are meaningful to other states. And you don't need to be an expert on Malaysia or on Vietnam or on the Philippines in order to get that minimum necessary threshold. Did they submit something to the UN or in their own domestic law, which fortunately is something that the UN tracks, as well as the United States Navy. And so I had a bunch of independent sources to compare and see if they make sense. But basically you can see whether or not the Philippines or Vietnam or Malaysia or Indonesia, or in some cases, as I'll posit with navigation rules, the United States and other potential users, especially affected states of this littoral space, how they have reacted and whether it's met, again, a fuzzy benchmark. I'm not the court. I'm not going to decide, yes, there's enough representative widespread practice that this should be considered a rule. It's more like we should know how they're reacting. And the interesting thing, I think you'll see, you haven't seen a lot of yes in this column. I found nothing until chapter 5. There was just that one. We could talk about this one individually. Innocent passage for warships in territorial seas. China is hardly alone in having a very different view of this than the United States. The United States contests operationally and diplomatically innocent passage claims all over the world, including among many allies, but importantly, including everyone in littoral East Asia, literally. And that's an important fact because, as I'll tell you when we get to this kind of recapping it and trying to think about it analytically or holistically, regional effects, and I should have said this sooner, is something just to really remember. The regional effects, at least in a geographic spatial body of law like this, law of the sea, are much, much more pronounced. China's law of the sea is a meaningful thing, I believe, in East Asian waters, not so much elsewhere. And it's in part because so few of their rules could travel elsewhere. There's no potential for other states adopting most of their rule-like claims or preferences for what the rules should be because they're not uniform and they're not consistent. And they're very geographically specific, except for a few. And this is what I discovered over the course of doing this, is that mostly, no, they're not going to be able to make new rules. They're not meaningfully changing what we think of the rules. innocent passage, we can go back to this. That's one where I think there's some real possibility. And in
But
fact,
they're not alone in that.
they're not alone. And I think if you were to ask a court now, they were to bring a case like this, a lot of compositions of courts would say there's a customary rule that you have to have prior notification, perhaps, maybe not authorization. They would find that in Asia. I feel quite confident. I'm not particularly happy about that from a freedom of the seas advocacy standpoint, but empirically seems to be the case. Then a real cluster of cases where I think, according to this standard that I laid out, which again, I'm quite interested in having a debate on whether it's a reasonable standard or not, because I do want to think about improving it and applying it elsewhere and thinking it through. But dispute resolution rules, really, it surprised me because, like I said, I'd been in China during this arbitration, and it felt like China's views on it were so outrageous in some ways. They just totally rejected the validity of the procedure, even though it's quite clear to any lawyer. They were a member of the treaty. The treaty defines the rules, the dispute resolution rules. It's not ambiguous. Even to Chinese lawyers, this is never ambiguous, that ultimately it's up to the court to decide if it has, again, if the case is admissible and if the court has standing. It was a law of the sea court. They found it was admissible. They found it had standing. China reminded us over and over again, appropriately, I think, that we have often thumbed our nose, or maybe not often, but we have, in fact, thumbed our noses at very important international arbitral, or rather, in this case, an adjudication or an advisory opinion, less significant. At any rate,
We never even ratified.
that's right. We've not, that goes without, I kind of buried the lead there. The United States has not ratified the Law of the Sea Treaty for reasons we can also discuss. But there's a very unusual situation here in terms of making rules within the treaty structure. We can talk about that. But ultimately, the United States, as well as I posit China, are focused on customary rules. That's where the conflict is. It's the behavioral side of this. So in dispute resolution rules, I found quite a lot of consistency in how China approaches it, quite a lot of principle, and I didn't need to look at the Law of the Sea specific documents either. I went into their treaty practice generally, and you look and see, do they accept compulsory dispute resolution measures anywhere? And really, they have started to do it within trade bodies, but the rule is, as you see there, the second one that I'm able to infer is that if there's any implications for sovereignty, it's out. And anything is implications for sovereignty if you wanted to in international law. It's just it's a discretionary choice that they're going to make. And you see a clear pattern in the way they make that discretionary choice. They are what Ian Johnston calls hyper sovereigntist. They have a very, very, very arch view of how serious that inviolable status is. And that translates very well to the basic question is like, who's going to decide which rules apply? The Chinese Communist Party is not interested in this bunch of European old white men making any decisions that bear on anything that they think is of any importance to them, especially not sovereignty. And there's a strong post-colonial vibe to that. There's a strong Marxist vibe to that. There's a strong Asian vibe to it. It's a strong belief. They're very consistent in this. And in practice, they are as well. And here's the interesting thing. So are a lot of other states in Asia. Not quite as extreme as China in some of the dimensions. And again, the chapter goes into a lot of detail on how I get to these conclusions. These are just summary.
So the list is sovereignty exception to compulsory.
That's
So
right.
Acquiesce to the Chinese exception, or
So no,
what?
I'm talking
what does
about
acquiesce and object mean?
they are, so you'll, it goes in deep, basically each rule, it's going to be a different thing that the state is doing in its practice that demonstrates whether it thinks what China's doing is okay, is
Oh, so-
against the
so they're
rules or not.
acquiescing to the Chinese interpretation. Brunei is, and the Indonesians are objecting.
Acquiesce in the sense that they didn't say anything or do anything. Acquiesce counts actually as on China's side.
Right.
The deck is stacked again, like I'm taking all the most
Okay.
disadvantageous
So acquiesce
views for
means
my argument. I'm trying
accepting the
to.
Chinese side, object means standing up.
Indonesia said specifically they don't accept that China wouldn't participate.
Yeah.
And China has been involved in astroturfing a lot of different
Yeah.
statements, and there are different ways to parse
Yeah.
what states said. What I'll posit to you, and which I can support with the empirics in the chapter, and I'll be interested to know if you think it's right, is that basically this one actually has quite a number of objections. So I don't think completely precluding all dispute resolution is not something that most states are okay with. But as you get into things like, this is interesting, just not recognizing disputes, very popular. That one may travel beyond Asia. actually. Japan does it with China in the Senkakus. China does it to the Vietnamese in the paracels. People do it all over the world. You just don't recognize, you don't let the legal process start. Britain was doing that until recently with Mauritius and the Chagos Archipelago. Now they're talking about it. They've acknowledged it. It's not clear that they've acknowledged Mauritian sovereignty over Diego Garcia, but they may. And there's a Chinese. The reason I know about this, Tom, is that I read what the Chinese international law community says. That's right. That's right. The Navy likes Diego Garcia. That's correct. But so here, this one may be not such an important finding. I think there are ways in which it is. We can talk about it. And then finally, I guess so there we have it. Oh, sorry, I skipped over this one. So the empirics for discussing a general principle. So I look at first dispute resolution within UNCLOS, and then the next set is dispute resolution generally. And one thing you can say is that China has this sort of sovereignty thread that pulls across all of these, and they'll go back to that. And that's the basis for precluding third-party dispute resolution. That's basically what I mean. The parallel to that, the solution, the synthesis of this antithesis is that bilateral dialogue and consultation is the way you solve disputes. And guess who goes along with that quite cheerfully is lots of states in Asia. They've said exactly those words over and over back to China in the context of these things. The code of conduct or declaration of conduct of the parties in the South China Sea, et cetera. That's the main body of empirical evidence on the South China Sea side of things. I look a lot. I guess this is worth saying up front. This is not just a story about the South China Sea. I look equally at the East China Sea. I wouldn't say I look equally at the Yellow Sea, but I also look at the Yellow Sea. I'm looking at it everywhere where China claims jurisdiction, China's law of the sea. Okay. And that's really the story. That's the big story. Anywhere that China claims jurisdiction, it effectively claims sovereignty. That's not what the law of the sea is supposed to do. But as we saw when they ratified a treaty that they viewed as incomplete, these are quotes from Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials, serious defects, woeful shortcomings, things like that. They were committed to renovating it all along. And the way they think about renovating it is in dialogue and consultation and in practice, in the ways that it puts these rules into practice, especially with its weaker neighbors. There's a real contradiction when it comes to the United States. It's quite problematic. And so when we zoom out, as I try to do in sort of a gesturing way in the conclusion, because there's not that much you can really say confidently about the effects on the international order, whatever that is. I try and distill kind of a top-down holistic assessment of what can we say about the scope in which China is affecting rules. One thing that I think I can say with pretty high degree of confidence is that China has developed something that could be called veto jurisdiction over resources. The Vietnamese, here's a good anecdotes. The Vietnamese have tendered bids for oil and gas development all over the southwest part of the South China Sea. And Japanese, Russian, Indian, American, Chinese, Vietnamese, many other nations' firms have bid on different parts of this and been awarded contracts in different parts of this. China has now put Vietnam in a position where they have told the Spanish and the Russians and the Japanese that their contracts are null and void because they can't do the work. And those, of course, those firms are kind of looking for an out too, because China's making it, exercising what you could call a veto jurisdiction. They're not going to exploit those resources either.
No one's going to get it.
No one's going to get them. And it's the same, maybe to a lesser degree of fisheries, because fisheries are much more fluid. But effectively, they try and deny other states the ability to fish in a way that is cost effective over time, I would argue. They've created a lot of cost on that side. Excuse me, and forgive the hoarse voice here. I'm trying to emulate Jerry Cohen, my great mentor and hero in all regards. But innocent passage, as I talked about, that's a real finding. I think it's really significant. I think there are policy issues here that really need to be addressed. Of course, EEZ military activities are another one. I don't see China having a clear rule on that. It's hard to say what it is other than a general statement, which holistically I think is supportable. There are lots of states that have what we call excessive claims with the Navy JAG manual for maritime claims, the Maritime Reference Manual, I think it's called. What they describe as excessive claims, as my colleague James Kraska has pointed out, from Iran stretching around the littoral to Russia, the whole of Eurasia. Every single one of those states has something that the U.S. State Department and U.S. Navy classifies as an excessive claim on navigation. Whether it's not allowing nuclear vessels, whether it's claiming security jurisdiction in a contiguous zone. There are a million specific things. Ultimately, the innocent passage one is one where I really see China being quite consistent, and there being a very deep base in the region, especially, but possibly global. So I've given it that potential scope because there are many other states who view it that way. And largely this G77 group, which continues to be China's natural constituency. So dialogue and consultation, I think, is a very regional norm. I think if you look at the aggregate, dispute resolution is very popular. Third-party dispute resolution is a subject of extraordinary research in our discipline, but it's not happening that way in this regional setting. And I think the politicized or the political processes are much more functional in East Asia. Perfect. Dispute non-recognition, again, I think it's a little bit of a throwaway finding, other than to say that you can kind of whistle past the graveyard forever on disputes. And it requires a choice. And I would argue it required a choice on the United States part. I'm curious what Tom's view is on when this happened to fight these battles. We quietly, usually, contest a lot of claims around the globe. I've been asked this by students, and there's like a reaction to say, oh, well, the Chinese claims are so much worse. In some ways they are, but actually, it's a political decision. It's a political decision. The Indians have outrageous claims about offshore archipelagos, the Lakshadweep archipelago. Some enterprising student, I hope, will pick that up and do a great study. China does have really extravagant claims in other ways. Don't get me wrong. They're really way out on a ledge, but they're rule type claims about like what should the rules be, quite poorly practiced or quite modest, like dispute non-recognition. So there's not a lot of full frontal clash, except for on these issues, again, of maritime military activities in exclusive economic zones, and I would add in the airspace above territorial seas and exclusive economic zones. Those are regulated also in part by the law of the sea. It sort of provides the geographic frame, and that is ultimately one of the areas that I want to extend moving forward. I'll stop here because I'm looking to expand this into looking at China in other global commons domains, especially so beyond jurisdiction. Issues of deep seabed mining, which are now actually relevant for the first time, and space and aerospace stuff as well, which is based on the law of the sea kind of framework. So that's the direction I want to travel, but I also want to do some robustness checks on whether or not I'm thinking about this in a useful way. So I'm looking at Tom, and I'm waiting for the.
Oh yeah,
I'm waiting for the bricks to come.
No bricks. I think this stuff you're doing is really interesting. I think you've shown pattern behavior that is objectionable, sometimes to the neighbors, sometimes to the United States and outside actors. But you're trying to get at, the source of the thinking behind the objectionable behavior. And whether it's objectionable or not, I'm not being judgmental. I'm saying people object.
There's an empirical objection.
Yeah,
to the behavior.
there's lots of objection to the behavior in the United
Not
States,
just the U.S.
and Japan, and in the region. And what I'm trying to separate out is, what is the broad. I push back. I'll say what my priors are. My bias is going in. My bias is going in as I push back on the normal narrative that China is trying to rewrite the rules of the international system as its power grows in a way that will benefit China and harm the rest of the world. Right? That's the current. It's in the national security strategy. It's in big documents of the United States. It's become like a bipartisan consensus, and I don't see it. Right? I see a combination of different interpretations of existing rules that go back to times before China's power was greater. So it's not a function of China's power. Or I see just brazen violations of existing rules, with China saying, as you said, this is our sovereignty. International law doesn't apply, which is a violation of a rule which has damaging effects on the institutions, but is not a replacement set of rules. It's just, these rules don't apply to me because it's my stuff. Right. Which is not, it's not like saying like you now have a new Thomas Jefferson to write a new constitution. It's just get out of my face. Right. Yes. And this is my stuff and stay away from me. And I see a lot of that. So and the interpretations on innocent passage, as you said, China's not alone. Other states believe that the US military or other military should at least alert them that they're doing innocent passage. And the US says we don't need to alert you and we don't need permission. And I think on permission, the United States would probably win. And maybe you're right, over time on alerting, maybe the United States wouldn't win if it ever got to a tribunal. And so, but that's a different interpretation. Then the EEZ rules on military exercises, China has a minority position. It's written in, my understanding is a codicil to their accession to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, said that they had that exception, that states would have to get permission to do military activities in their EEZ.
Not in that statement, only the innocent passage is in there. They submitted a statement when they signed UNCLOS in '96. UNCLOS does say you can't make any reservations. Some treaties allow them, some don't. But they effectively tried to make a reservation on innocent passage because they said, and the record of the negotiations bear this out. China did actually, that's the one substantive issue where they showed up and they were like, look, we think the treaty should say prior authorization.
And they were in the minority, but they did it. But
So then they
India
said-
agreed with them. Some other countries agreed with them. So they weren't alone. So that's an interpretation. But my understanding is the EEZ rules, the idea that a country can't exercise militarily without informing China. I know it's in domestic law in China, but I think it's also a position that they took in international fora along with some other states.
Yes.
That they're not alone, that it's a minority interpretation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea that the United States and the British and others and the French always rejected. And the argument that I've heard from a historical perspective is that exception, if it were accepted by the majority of states, would have killed the whole convention. That the most powerful actors would have never accepted that kind of restriction, and they kind of tolerated the minority group's position and said, we're just going to ignore it. So there's that. And then there's stuff where China just breaks the rules, right? And the way that China breaks the rules, your map is complicated, so it's hard to call it up and use it.
I can help interpret.
So-
It is
so-
complicated, but reading the book will help you.
So
interpret.
the 9- line doesn't break the rules, it's just irrelevant.
Actually, have-
So then the 9- line is just irrelevant to the international law because it's too big to mean anything.
Well,
Unless it means all the features within the 9- line are Chinese.
Yes.
If it means that, that's consistent with, if it means anything
that's what
else,
the Taiwanese government,
initially.
Maing Zhou basically has said.
Yeah.
That's what they
So the-
continue to view the whole purpose
so
of it as
the-
having been.
Yeah, so the 9- line was the 11- line of the Republic of China, inherited by the PRC. I don't know why it went from 11 to 9. I mean,
It was
there's
negotiations with the Vietnamese.
guy rid of
And
2 lines.
both the only successful negotiations
Yeah.
as well as all of the
Yeah.
violence. Somehow China,
Yes, sir.
Vietnam is where all that action.
So
is.
it's a 9- line now. It's largely the same as the ROC line from history. And the only way it's legal is if it means all the features and islands within it are Chinese. And here's where I think the presentation isn't misleading because there's a possibility of sovereignty disputes being settled by international tribunals. But my strong understanding of this is that only happens when all the disputants agree to have the sovereignty dispute itself settled. So it's happened in history. I think it happened between Malaysia and Singapore, and
States can consent to
Yeah,
anything.
but they can use the court for this purpose. So,
Yes.
you know, Chungju and I have a sovereignty dispute, and if we say, look, you know, we're going to cut it somehow. We'll never settle this. Let's just let the tribunal decide, right? And it's like 2 companies going to arbitration,
Yes.
right? Or sports figures going to arbitration. So you have that possibility, but it's very rare. Most of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is about interpretation of what sovereignty means, not about whose sovereignty it is. And the tribunal in 2016 was all about interpretation.
That's
So-
all they have authority to.
And the
go
Philip-
on, interpretation and application
And
of the law of the sea. Again, that's that
Yeah.
one specific treaty instrument in a big body of law.
so the Philippines was wise to not raise the sovereignty
Oh,
disputes.
very much so. They couldn't.
Because China was never going to show up, and if you don't have both sides, you can't do it. So what they did instead is say, whatever China's interpretation of what they own is, and we disagree with that, they can't get all this stuff and they can't behave the way they did, right? And the Philippines won a landslide victory for sure, but where China clearly violates the conventional law to sea, either directly or through pattern behavior, as you say, pattern, I like that, pattern behavior, is where it draws straight baselines in the paracels, which is illegal for a continental state to draw straight baselines between a set of islands. It's clearly illegal. And when you draw a baseline, a straight baseline, you can then do a 200 nautical mile EEZ off the baseline. So you get a huge swath of.
So these are actually formal drawn baselines, these solid lines that they've submitted, they're on the UN, there's their charts. This whole area here is just notional.
Yeah.
I just read Poland's maps to show here the notional set of straight baselines around the whole stratum,
Right.
but their law and their statements to the UN say quite. And indeterminately, basically, that they project 200 nautical miles from everything. They also say they project, you can see here, this is an extreme projection that couldn't actually happen, but they basically say Japan doesn't get any exclusive economic zone, they're just a very small one, because we're going to get extended continental shelf beyond 200.
So they want both, they want it both ways. So the China wants the benefits of being a continental power with a continental shelf, and it wants to be an archipelagic state with straight baselines, and it is a continental power. You can see it's a continental power, right? So like, I'm not making it up. That's not a legal interpretation. So it doesn't get the straight baselines. So even though it claims the straight baselines in the paracels, that's illegal. And then in the South China Sea, the southern part of the South China Sea, the Spratlys, they haven't clarified what their claims are in terms of interpretation, because they haven't clarified their claims. They haven't clarified what the 9-dash line means. They haven't come out and said so. But if you're Indonesian, it sure appears that they're behaving in a way that's consistent with a straight baseline in the Spratlys, which would be illegal and obnoxious. So my view of it is I'm concerned about the same behavior. What I see is a combination of minority interpretations of existing law that goes way back. So it's not new and it's not a function of Chinese power, and just straightforward violations of existing rules that are consequential because China is a very important actor in the world and these seas are very important. So if it's violating the rules, it's undercutting the rule of law. But I don't see an alternative set of interpretations that China is trying to say, this is the way the world should look at straight baselines for continental powers, and they should apply in Latin America, they should apply in India, and the old rules are wrong, and here's why they're wrong, and we had 10 Chinese lawyers to say in consensus that we need new rules to replace the old rules. And that's how it's being portrayed in the United States, and I think that's consequential, because I think it's easier to rally other states against the Chinese position when they're in clear violation
Of the whole
of the rule, of the rules-based international order as it applies to this behavior. And I think that the Philippines case, and a lot of my colleagues made fun of the Philippines case when it happened, because the Philippines didn't have the authority to carry through. And what did it mean? I think it meant a lot because it made it easier for various international actors to use the Chinese behavior in a diplomatic way as leverage to get more pressure on China to stop violating rules. And that's useful. And I thought it was a brilliant case. I thought they were fantastically successful. And I think it's consequential to this day. And all that said, it's not really a question, unless I end with the British, isn't it, at the end? I think that it's very different from China creating new rules. I think the pattern behavioral stuff is the violation, rather than the pattern behavioral stuff is creating new rules. And that's a pretty minute debating point.
No,
but that's what I'm going to say when we do the University of Toronto thing. So I'm prefacing my comments.
Thank you for giving me a chance to muscle up beforehand.
Yeah,
I think that's a very reasonable way of.
but I'm worried about
about
the
it.
same stuff you're worried about.
Yeah, and actually, I'm glad that you said this point about like the effects on Latin American law, the sea norms. This is a really important and generalizable claim about a lot of Chinese foreign policy, and especially now that I'm down in DC, I've been making this case about military power projection from bases or ports as well. China's got a different way of engaging with this global system, especially when you're talking about military power projection. This space right here, China projects a lot of military power because of the mainland right next to it. extraordinary. Arguably much more power than the United States can generate in that space. When China looks further out, they're trying to sustain that advantage there. That's their main focus. What are we doing out of area that's sustaining our focus there? They don't care about a uniform system of rules for the globe. That's America's problem. It always has been, as far as they're concerned. And the idea that there's a project to build anything like a global rules-based international order sounds like, you know, American imperialist ideology, basically. The Chinese view is that it's a UN-centric system. That's what they always say. It's a UN-centric system. And UN is the body in which they're willing to engage in international law. And sovereignty is the principle of this regime. And we have a veto over anything if it gets out of hand.
Yeah.
That's sort of where they're oriented on it.
Yeah.
And that's fine because the US is so invested, as my now boss, Evan Feigenbaum, put it, the opposite of a responsible stakeholder, which is his concept, is not an irresponsible stakeholder. It's a free rider.
Yeah.
They get to benefit from the fact that the United States is invested, for better and for worse, in projecting power all around the globe.
Right.
So this is also not saying China's not going to project power all around the globe. Oh, absolutely. In fact, they already do. It's different, though. The PLA Navy doesn't need to change the policy in Beijing in order to exercise its blue seas capability. They do it routinely because the United States is fine with it. The Japanese are fine with it. We may not actually be in our heart of hearts, especially in a couple of years, but as a matter of our policy and our law, we are. And that's how they approach law, bilaterally.
Right.
So all the states there, I do go through their practice. They have violated their own rules numbers of times on this. And that is one of the reasons that it's not rule forming.
Yeah.
They do things in Japan's EEZs that they don't accept in their own and say contradictory things about it. You're not making a rule when you do that.
So we agree.
What you're doing. And so I think a different way of saying it, Tom, is that what's the overall effect on the rules in East Asia? I would call it dilution.
It erodes the power of the rules when major actors break them on a regular basis. So it's consequential, but it's different than the narrative. It's different than the narrative
very much so.
That China is trying to create a new set of rules that will benefit China. And the implication, and this is kind of interesting from an American perspective, the implication is that the old rules were designed to help the United States. And I don't think it was that simple. I think American leaders, when a lot of these rules were created, American leaders were farsighted enough to realize that we'll be fine under a fair set of rules and others will benefit too, and it won't all be about us. But the realist logic is there for the history in the Americas. It must have been to the US advantage. And if China's powerful now, it must need a new set of rules to replace the old. It's like Robert
It was to
Gilpin.
neither of our advantage, actually. This was one of these rare
like
cases.
Robert Gilpin.
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't study with Robert Gilpin, but actually, if you're looking for IR theory in this, Gilpin is the one I'm using as my model for the top down. It's the clearest way of thinking about it that I've seen. Rules and rights structure the system for him. They're really important.
But his guiding assumptions is that the rules were created to benefit the most powerful state, and that's the part where
that's one of the reasons that in my
not-
dissertation I spent a lot of time laboring with why none of these paradigms are useful for this case because it confounds all of them. And now I don't do any of that. Don't worry.
So there's another consequence. We have Tabitha Mallory, and I'll open it up after this.
Okay.
We have Tabitha Mallory and our great team of 50 plus postdocs that these guys have joined. She does fisheries. And my understanding from reading her stuff and from reading other stuff is that 70% of the global violation charges against companies that are doing fishing where they shouldn't without permission are Chinese companies. So that means that they're violating the rules on fisheries around the world and the EEZs and fisheries. I don't think they have an alternative set of rules for fisheries. It's just that the Chinese ships are violating.
Disorderly.
It's disorderly conduct. It's destructive conduct, and it should be addressed. But it shouldn't be addressed by saying, well, they want different rules.
It's not the Chinese world.
If we accept their rules on fisheries, we'll be in trouble. No, if we accept them violating the existing rules, we'll be in trouble.
I think there are genuinely some slippery slopes to tack onto this, but this ain't it. That's not how international law is going to work. And I think I feel quite confident in saying that that's not the type of knock-on effects that we're going to see. To the extent that there are other states that are predisposed to disregard the law of the sea, then it's pretty effective because it dilutes its overall effects. When China says, we don't care about this ruling, that's not good for the court.
No.
Overall, that weakens the institution. Similarly, if China practices in East Asia in a way that pattern behaviors that erode the possibility that, for example, I've asked Southeast Asian colleagues many times, or excuse me, Chinese colleagues many times to draw the Southeast Asian EEZs onto this map that they submitted to the UN.
Yeah.
Where is the 200 nautical mile?
200 nautical miles like from Malaysia.
From Malaysia, yeah.
Here, where's the EEZ for any of these states under this?
But you know the answer.
Notional.
But you know the answer.
scheme.
This is why the Philippines tribunal case was so important. The answer is largely dependent on what those features are. Are they islands or are they rocks or are they low tide elevation?
Gonna be sitting this whole time.
If they're islands, then you get 200 nautical miles around them. And then the question is, whose are they?
Yeah.
Which, is it Filipino island or is it a Malaysian island or is it
Well-
a Chinese island? Because it's not just China, all these countries.
From a probability standpoint, it's a Vietnamese islands because they occupy 20 some odd of them and the Chinese only have 8.
If
If you're just randomly picking them
Yeah.
out of a hat.
If
We
people-
don't do that. kind of
I
studies.
no, but I worry about that standard because that's gonna lead.
No, it's not right.
That's gonna lead people to get driven off of islands. And
Well,
that's gonna be violent.
To talk about some practical implications, China's claims imply that there's no room for Vietnamese sailors on an island in
Yeah.
the Spratlys.
Yeah,
And we've seen repeatedly that they're willing to evict Vietnamese sailors from islands, first in the Paracels and then in the Spratlys, 74 and then 88. I worry about that. That's the
Yeah.
one. I don't worry that much about the US and China accidentally through this ISR intelligence surveillance reconnaissance stuff. They're pretty careful. They're paying a lot of attention. China has done some risky things, but it's under
Yeah.
control. Neither side intends that to be the reason they have a fight. And so there's lots of things that could be done to de-escalate. There are lots of escalatory potential baked into China, Vietnam, and it's demonstrable.
right.
And it puts the United States, getting to some of China's broader power interest, puts the United States in a very, very difficult.
Because we have no claims and we have no.
Very difficult for the United
Not
States
only we
to
have no
justify.
claims, we have no position on the claims. That's a global
Exactly.
policy. That's a lot of people don't realize that when we quote unquote side with the Philippines, or we side with Malaysia, or we side with Vietnam,
Not on
it's
sides.
we're only siding with them in the terms of complaining about the Chinese behavior. We're not siding with them on the sovereignty. And that limits the.
Although there's a lot of voices calling for us to side with the Japanese, side with the Filipinos, side with the Vietnamese, et cetera, on our declaratory policy. I don't think it will happen, but I don't know what will happen. And it seems like
Yeah,
DC is a pretty interesting place to be right now.
yes.
Not only for
Other
that reason.
people, I'm sorry. I have to do this with them. So I gave them the whole, I used up all my ammunition. So
Ah,
now
man.
you got it all.
All right.
Wilson, go
Thanks,
ahead.
Tom.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, okay. Talk about Jefferson is very interesting. I'm reading the book, I think about the latest between Jefferson and John Adams, and one of the biggest issue at the time was 20-50 years ago, whaling rights.
Uh-huh,
yeah.
In the US.
Law of the Sea is
Very
great.
interesting.
There's so many
Really
interesting
big, yeah.
Law of the Sea stories.
My question revolves around 4 issues. Number one, the number one thesis is that liberal democracies don't fight one another with each other.
Uh-huh.
2, Samuel Huntington's theory of project generations.
Mhm.
Then Fukuyama's,
Yeah.
window of history, kind of
Yeah.
democracy. Then international law, customary law, there's no way of enforcing it because there's no
No, police.
enforcing body. In a way, and any powerful country can do whatever it wants.
Yeah.
So within this framework, number one, is there a growing Chinese exceptionality, like as a way of thinking that can lead to conflict with the West,
Mhm.
especially with their road and belt initiative, which is
Yeah.
Everywhere. And two, their economy is gonna be number one economy in 60s, 1920, and 21.7, that's pretty expected, so. My question is, do you think that Chinese exceptionalism, if it exists, leads to international war with the US and other
Yeah.
nations?
There you go, Isaac.
This one's for me?
You're
Okay,
Naval War College,
it's true.
keeping the war in War College.
That's right. Well, as far as I understand, the purpose of the war college is to prevent the naval war.
I
with
understand.
China, going from a war college to peace endowment, I haven't changed my stripes. I'm
Right.
trying to avoid the war.
Yeah.
It's always been that way.
Yeah, of course.
At any rate, Chinese exceptionalism is a very interesting term. I'm going to focus on that. There's obviously the story of American exceptionalism, very famous kind of way of framing what it means to be I think the French call us the hyperpower.
Yeah.
Yeah. China's got something like that. I think great powers with, you talked about Sam Huntington, with that's problematic, but also just like some sort of civilizational messianic identity that their leadership can have when they're the head of a state like that. And yeah, they think there's some, it's not divine providence like it is for the United States, but there's some destiny or you know, 重大复兴 of China or whatever. It's like there's a real feeling that, and it manifests quite clearly in international law, but not in a way that I think is necessarily distinctive of China. I think it's a great power attitude towards international law. China has, and I've spent a lot of time trying to understand China's, the exquisite detail of China's attitude towards international law. I'm very focused on those issues, but from like a, just kind of like a rough, except if the question is exceptionalism or exemptionalism, I sometimes see, which is a slight variation on it. There's been some interesting international law writing on this. China's a lot like other big states. The sovereignty piece is something that's really strong in the Chinese case, but they're not the only ones with a very strong value on that parameter, if you want to model it out. Whatever. It's just like it dominates their decision-making on a lot of these things. And that ends up being, to me, the way that they're exceptional in the sense that they basically say there's a sovereign exception or exemption for anything. And the US does basically the same, except we are much more sophisticated about our international legal arguments than they are.
And then Mondry Miller, one of our fellows, Wilson, wrote a book about how India also has this kind of we used to be a great empire and we're coming back type of attitude that affects its foreign policy in a similar way to China. So it's a great question. The only thing I would say myself is that the United States and Canada on a regular basis have kind of, we square off over fisheries in the Pacific and the Atlantic side, where we share overlapping EEZs. And the political science literature codes these things as militarized interstate disputes because the two countries' coast guards have guns on them, and they square off on occasion to protect their respective fishermen. But where the democratic peace thing always kicks in and why I get frustrated with large end data sets in my field is there's really no chance that Canada, the United States, this is going to escalate into an interstate war because
you're wrecking our deterrent.
Yeah.
Making it
no,
credible.
I'm wrecking IR theory because it's much harder to have large end data sets because wars, fortunately, are relatively rare. So they're a small end. But if you can expand the set of wars to include every time two countries' militarized ships come close to each other, then you can call that a militarized interstate dispute. And you get, in fact, if you use that measure, the United States and Canada have a much more tense relationship than the United States and China, just because we're next to each other and we have the fishery overlapping, because those things happen so often. But I think that democratic peace holds, and that we'll settle our disputes in Canada without escalation.
But is it because we're liberal Democrats that we're going to settle our disputes with
I think
Canada?
So. I do think
That's
so.
the best.
I think that's a big part of the story. We fought together in wars. We have a history, and if it was all sheer power, it would be terrifying to be Canadian. You have this huge border with the United States, right? Like nobody even pays attention to it. So, anyway, Jemima, go ahead.
So I have, thank you very much. I have two questions. First about, so the first thing about was, it has to be a little bit more about the relationship between the kind of implementation of the resolution, because in both the last talk about that, so and so in light of that, actually, what in your view could be and specifically stalemate between having the rules, disputing the rules, and then no mechanism by which to resolve those rules, apart from my mind, or complete stalemate, because I thought what you were saying about that's more by but the question then is, you know, how I'm not necessarily resolved issues that are so practical. When we should be small in that. That's what I think about that. My kind of and it's I'm also interested in the extension of maritime. I'm curious about what you would look at so far and how we can get for the space and whether there are also buying into this that vibration of that.
Right. Two really good questions. Thank you. So first one really is a very practical question in a sense, like if this is the circumstance and these are some of the limitations of this international law apparatus and machinery, like what's an appropriate way to deal with it? From China's standpoint, negotiation and consultation bilaterally, and maybe some papering over of things with this ASEAN and China process. I think there's not really an instrument that they desire, what they want, and the way. So worth talking a little bit about what I guess I would think of as like the sociology of international law in China. I got a great chance to just spend a lot of time with people who work in that world, and like what they think of their job is one of the things that I'm always kind of like asking, like, what is it that they think they're like, what's motivating them? And you sort of spend enough time and start to think about it. And like, in this case, they're pretty indifferent about like, there's no strong commitment to this particular way of the law of the sea being interpreted. They're constantly coming up with different legal justifications for dependent archipelagos in mid-ocean spaces. Tom was talking about the Indian version of it. I was with the people as they were developing the Chinese theory of the case. The policy comes first. They said, we're drawing lines around this. And then they had to come up with what they're going to do about it. And so I think that tells you something about the way that negotiations will work too. And you do have limited cases empirically of China negotiating the 2 dashes away. That was a Mao giving wartime besieged Vietnamese comrades couple trivial, in their view, islands that were disputed between them and nobody was on except for fishermen or whatever. It's just a gesture or something like that. But basically, they haven't used any international legal tools for any of this. They're all bilateral. They're all based on their individual political relationships, and they want to keep it that way. And they've been very, very, very clear. And I think it was extremely unfortunate and unwelcome that the Philippines decided to lodge this suit. It's created this huge blemish on their practice record. Like, they don't have a leg to stand on when they say we're the ones upholding the law of the sea. It was very unfortunate. And there were a lot of hearts broken in my world because these are people that invested in the law of the sea. All the Chinese law of the sea people were like, at least show up and argue against jurisdiction. They actually have some, I don't think they would have won, but they might have. And at least this is what the United States did. At least you've then put your interpretation on the record
but they
in a
didn't show
formal
up.
sense. No, they treated it with contempt and scorn. And it's basically because it's just not, when push comes to shove, China's practice of any international legal treaty does not win out in their decision-making on what to do. If and when Xi Jinping heard about the suit, I don't think there was a very nuanced discussion about, well, what exactly are the legal implications of this? I think they decided, no, this is completely illegitimate, and let's figure out why.
But it could be revealing in a different way along the same lines you say, and that if China's interpretation of what they have now is extremely expansive, then they can only lose, and they can only lose in a negotiated outcome, and they don't want to be clear about it.
Yes, I think that's right.
So anything that would clarify anything would only pull back from what they're currently thinking is theirs. So why buy? If you can't win, you can only lose. The best you can do is get what you think you already have. Then why?
Just to chime in on this, the most strategic idea I've heard about this comes from Admiral Mike McDevitt. You probably know.
Yeah.
Which is that we should be brokering the territorial and or maritime settlements between the other claimants, not China.
Right.
That's obviously the right.
We should be encouraging them to talk about this.
But for a variety of reasons, that's very, very challenging. Because Japan and South Korea have a lot of
it's
maritime
not
disputes.
just
Good luck.
China. That's what people like. The Vietnamese and the Filipinos
Yes.
have overlapping
Yes.
claims. They don't agree on them. So Admiral McDevitt's point is, if on principle, if you want to start this kind of process, get the other dyads to talk about their differences. But it's hard to do that.
Yes, not that easy. And so on, just turning to the rest of this question. So China is going to resist any of the institutional mechanisms, and it's very difficult to see there being a lot of scope for those being applied. Vietnam has dangled this idea that they're going to launch another suit. That would be part of the process that I would see leading to another China-Vietnam kinetic fight.
Yeah.
Maybe it would come after that or before it. I don't know, but that would be very problematic. It's very escalatory for China. They've showed how hard they're going to react when something like that happens. Their view, interestingly, I think is a lot like what Gilpin describes as peaceful incremental change to rules and rights through practice.
Yeah.
That's the only stable pathway. There's some gradual change in the polarity that's not too disruptive. That's what they'd like to see. But when you have these punctuations like we sue you in a court and we have this judgment, it's not helpful for the, I believe, peaceful incremental change that they're trying to produce. Coercive, but peaceful in their.
So how about space?
So yes, that's right. So extending to space. So I actually don't know. This really is the next frontier for me. I'm trying to tee up this project. I just had a very able junior fellow at Carnegie develop an awesome bibliography. Sharon Dew, she's on her way to Yale Law School next year. She did a brilliant job. It's great work, and I'm going to start reading and start thinking about those extensions. But what I can say and what I know so far is it's not just my fevered imagination that the law of the sea is like, I see all the parallels. They use it as the template for thinking about space law from an international, like a practical standpoint. That's about as far as I can go. Space is very confusing to me when you start applying that type of spatial rules. And the real key difference here is there is no sovereign space at all. There just can't be outer space. But as we saw recently,
Don't say balloon. Don't say balloon.
Tom, I would never say it. I would never say it in public. I've been steadfastly avoiding it. Stratospheric space, near Earth orbits, low Earth orbits, all these things, there's lots of variation. That's the place where China wants to play, and what the way I've described, following from the Tiaofa, the part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that does treaties and law. They talk about frontier areas and space, aerospace and space, deep seabed, high seas beyond national jurisdiction, and polar regions. Those are the ones they call Qianyan frontier. Those are ones that are beyond national jurisdiction. So the China sovereignty piece doesn't obtain there, except on their sovereign vessels. Same in space, same in the high seas. Your vessel, the flag, that's what makes it sovereign. And I think that's the analogy for space, except there's no jurisdictional space. There's no zones around, or maybe there are. Maybe there will be zones around your assets in space the same way, maybe there are, and I don't even know about it. I really don't know what I don't know about space law, other than China's super interested in it. Because unlike the law of the sea, and this is an important kind of practical point, the law of the sea is based mostly on this very, very long accretion of practice, customary rules. Space is not.
Yeah.
Deep seabed is not. Polar regions maybe, but kind of not. And that's why they call them frontier areas. And I think their theory of the case, to me, sounds intuitively correct. This was a hard one for them to win. It's going to be hard to change these rules. It's going to be hard to make them the way that China wants to see them, because they've developed over the course, from their standpoint, of European maritime imperialism. That's the origin of it.
But that's the key thing for Vietnam. I just want to say, when I was in the government, I visited Hanoi, and they just screamed about what they call the cow's tongue, which is the 9-dash line of the cow's tongue. They were very upset about it.
Yes.
They kept showing me maps, and I kept saying the standard U.S. The United States takes no position on the sovereignty. We just ask that all sovereign disputes be handled peacefully.
It's a tough job.
But eventually I broke, and I had the lights on me, and I broke.
Oh, God.
Okay, it looks weird. It looks weird to me too. And that was bad. It was a bad day for the.
I can imagine.
But when you look at the map on the left, I just realized that's the Zhonghua Minguo. That's the RFC map.
That's the original
The
ROC
dash line, right?
Yeah.
So look at Vietnam there, right? Vietnam there is a French colony.
Mhm.
So this map was drawn, and the successor map from the PRC says, look, it's just comes from history. We didn't do anything. We're not aggressive.
Yes.
And that sounds convincing unless you're Vietnamese. And they say, well, when that old map that you inherited was drawn, we were a French colony, had no say in anything. And you're supposed to be a post-colonial national state like us. And now we're independent, and you have our whole coastline.
That's right.
And it's not fair. And those are the imperial days. So
Maybe China
they
will be
feel very
sympathetic to
strong.
that.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, the effacement of those two dashes, as well as the return of some sovereign islands that were disputed, And much later, same area in the 90s and culminating with the treaties in 2000, 2004, they settled, it's in the other maps, a little piece of the Tonkin Gulf.
Yeah, that's the little, that's the.
Just a little bit. Yeah.
Just this little line right behind.
Right here.
Beibu.
Yeah, Beibu for China and Tonkin.
Yeah.
The other Gulf of Tonkin incident. I'm actually writing a piece on this negotiation now. I think it's a really interesting case. But nothing else.
So, but that's my follow-on question from Jemima is because she asked about space. I'm just wondering why they settled so many things on land. And
Taylor's.
this is the question for Taylor Fable. I was on his committee, you know, and I asked him at the time and I'd never seen an answer. China has compromised on sovereignty a lot with a lot of its neighbors, but hardly ever at sea. And I don't know what the logic is. I can't explain.
I have that in the intro. I think Taylor's book is tremendous, but I think will tell you himself, like it's not, the story doesn't apply equally in the maritime space. There's so few cases, but what you see is there's no cases of compromise except for this little
That
one.
one exception.
And it's almost all the escalation. It's a majority of the escalation that he codes. And you're like, well, wait a minute, something's different about the maritime space. Why aren't they cooperative at all? There?
What, does anyone have anyone in the room have an opinion on that? Because I think it's an open question. Because the standard argument that you hear in sort of semi-knowledgeable circles in the United States is, well, these are Asian post-colonial nationalist countries, and they take sovereignty extremely seriously, like all post-colonial nationalist countries, and they'll never compromise on sovereignty, because once they start to compromise on sovereignty, they feel like they're going to lose everything. It's a psychological position. But the problem in the Chinese case is China compromised on land with almost all of the other disputants and gave more than they took. In other words, they gave up more than half of the disputed area in most cases, except for India, right? India is the exception. But with the stands and with Russia,
Quite a lot.
quite a lot of space. And in history, they gave up all of Mongolia as a nation.
That's right.
And it doesn't seem to be that controversial. But at sea, if it's
Yeah.
Taiwan, if it's a Senkaku, a Diaoyu dispute, if it's South
Mhm.
China Sea, no, not an inch. We can't give up an inch. And no one even lives there. So,
I mean,
except Taiwan.
I'm biased having come from the naval war college, but I think it's a maritime strategy thing. I locate this in China, recognizing that its overall survival and national well-being depends on the maritime, but it's a continental state. And there's this whole mythology of we've been invaded. There's literally a number 478 times from the sea. I've seen it over and over and over and over again. And there's been a huge surge, it's relatively recent, frankly,
Yeah.
but devotion to maritime power, Haiyang Qiangguo, which is not just a naval concept at all. In fact, it's majority not naval. The port stuff that I'm studying, that's maritime power.
yeah.
Go ahead.
To your point, sir, about the American border and sea border and ancient community the kinds of population is. And that is fairly.
Sure. Yeah, it's all
Right.
98% are going to be within a couple.
And that's Admiral McDivitt's argument. He works at the Center for CNAS, right?
The Center for Naval Analysis.
Center for CNA.
Yeah.
Yes, Center for Naval Analysis. He's been a leader there for a long time, and he's always argued in public and in private that the fact that the population and the wealth of China is along the coast means that they're going to want to control a very large piece of maritime domain outside of it to prevent that from threatening from outsiders. He's been saying that since the 90s, and it's looking more.
Chinese navalists and Chinese strategists have been saying, and the question is, at what point did the direction of the ship of state really turn towards it? We actually have some CWP fellows who've done some really interesting work. Andrew Chubb in particular.
Yeah.
Like, what was the set of like the timing of the shift and the nature of the shifts? And he's looking at one piece of it,
Yeah.
but ultimately what we see is China has invested a lot in its maritime capabilities across the board. And the maritime disputes are that's the closest version of it. It's that they need this. I've seen versions of China's maritime space talked about like Lebensraum, that kind of thing. It's like, we need this space. Our per capita resource base is so low. And that's one of their disputes with the law of the sea. It's that we have the biggest population, but our EEZs are nothing. We don't have fisheries. Oh, yeah, that question
There's
came
a
up.
term,
I wanted to go back to that.
Shengsun Kongjian.
Yeah.
And it's
Sur-
exactly
survival
like,
space.
Laban-
Yes,
it's
it's
exactly
Lebensraum.
like
That's the
Lebensraum.
word.
They should be careful.
It's scary. When I saw
I
it,
don't know,
I
do you guys know the term Lebensraum? It's a German term that Hitler used for expanding Germany.
doesn't have great.
It doesn't have great
Connotation.
connotations, and China has the exact.
It's
phrase.
very prevalent and it reflects a strategic. Yeah, I don't mean to like muddy the waters with Nazi analogy. I think it's quite different, but ultimately there's a
Yeah.
similar kind of resource scarcity, very extreme logic to it that I think you do see it. And this is my critique on Chubb, is that in some ways it's just the sheer capacity in hulls and in diplomats and bodies to throw at the problem and in wealth that has led them to act on a set of strategic goals that they've had for some time. They just couldn't really do it. And so they were accepting certain realities. But now that they can, in practice, repeatedly behave in what they view as a non-escalatory way, certainly not trying to bring it up to the level where there's going to be missiles flying. Over time, they expect Gilpin's peaceful incremental change. And as to, I think there was a question hanging out there on the fisheries, which I forgot to get to, something about the Chinese being 70% of all the
Chinese
IUU
companies,
fishing,
yeah.
right? Well, one interesting thing, and Tabitha knows a ton about this, but like they mostly, if you're in Ghana, they have a joint venture with a Ghanaian firm,
Yeah.
but it's dominated by a Chinese firm and it's Chinese ships, and they take the catch and they process it and send it back to China, and all of the wealth goes to the Ghanaian partner and the Chinese firm and nothing else. That's
Mhm.
sort of the model.
Yeah.
And so I don't even know,
Or at
this
least
is the
that's a
nature of
contract.
fishing, right?
But that's a contract. This, I think what these 70% are, the
Of the
70% of
IUU
just
fishing.
getting caught without
Getting
a
caught.
contract.
Yeah, that's right.
Not
So
supposed
it's
to
not,
be
it's
there.
not clear. Tabitha will again have a very sophisticated view. IUU fishing is very hard to measure because
Yeah.
you're talking about vast space and the inferences are limited based on what you see. But basically China has by far the world's biggest distance fishing, and they're not regulated by the government's interpretations of what the law of the sea says anyway. That's not how that state kind of works its fishing industry. The fishing industry has its own rules, and the most important thing is its scale. China's huge resource demands,
Huge, yeah.
and they scale things like, especially building ships and processing plants and all the
Yeah.
things that you need to
Yeah,
move fish
fair
around the
enough.
globe.
You have other questions? Yeah, Chandra.
So my question is, the overarching question is, to what extent are those international laws actually matter in those territorial disputes? Because you and Tom mentioned a lot about Vietnam, but Hanoi seemed pretty happy with the map, with the Chinese map in the 50s and 60s. And Hanoi was kind of frustrated. Well,
I mean, they were a little busy.
yes, that's true, but they appeared to be satisfied with the map. I mean,
Yeah.
Kardon even wrote a letter to Bill and I saying that Hanoi agreed with China's control or southern naval management
Right.
in the South China Sea.
Not exactly. I mean, there's a whole legal controversy about it, but
And there's also a legal concept of positions taken under duress.
Yeah.
yes.
that's-
So in the 50s and 60s, the Vietnamese communists, which were you're talking the North Vietnamese, they were totally dependent on China for their survival against the French and then the Americans. So it's, that would be considered under duress. That was a temporary position under duress.
Yeah, I think the short answer is that probably neither China nor Vietnam would be confident bringing it to a court that they're going to win because the case is complicated.
Yeah, that's-
And I think that, it's worth noting that's not what anybody's trying to adjudicate here. And like China's claims to islands are outrageous, but so are a lot of the other claims. The
Vietnamese-
reality is nobody really should have sovereignty over any of these features because nobody lives there and they're an artifact of the treaty being such as it is that
Yeah.
you can have these artificial islands now that China claims.
The
creates
second
homes.
most expansive claims are the Vietnamese claims.
Yes.
I think
that's
it
fair.
goes way
Well,
out.
yeah,
the Taiwanese
Not
and
as
the
big as
Vietnamese.
9.
I would say.
Oh, they're
Taiwan, Taiwan and
yeah.
Vietnam, although Taiwan.
I
is
have a
somewhat
one
more
China
modest.
policies.
Right. Well, they unfortunately have different law of the sea policies in Taipei and Beijing, so.
Yeah.
Not that different, but
But then the Senkakus, I was under the impression from my work in the State Department and since that if China would agree to arbitration, Japan would agree to arbitration because Japan's pretty confident it would win over the DIU. that they have a better case historically, that
Mhm.
they have put together all the paperwork, that they had
Yeah.
claimed the Senkakus as what's called terra nullius before the 1895 war, so it wasn't caught up in the Cairo Declaration. So they're pretty confident they would win that. Ma Ying-jeou, the former president of Taiwan, wrote his thesis on
Under Gary Cohen. no
under
less.
Jerry Cohen at Harvard and said, no, it's the Republic of China would win, not
Yes.
the People's Republic, but the Republic of China would win. But the Japanese, so that one, I think, but even there, the United States still, despite all the statements that the Senkakus fall under the alliance,
We don't say they're sovereign.
we don't
Japanese
say
territory.
we don't say it's sovereign Japanese territory. So we've been very pure on that. And it's complicated because it's frustrating from a diplomatic point of view, not just say we take the Filipino side, they're allies. But we don't take the side on the sovereignty. We only take the side on how the sovereignty dispute is carried out. But we didn't, one thing, because we're waiting for dinner, so we.
Okay.
As
As you can see, I'll talk about this all day, so you just tell me when. to shut up.
So, no, I just wanted to go back to the tribunal ruling
Yeah.
and what's the technical thing for the ruling?
It was an award
An award by the,
by the tribunal, or sorry, excuse me, by the, it was an Annex 7 arbitration under the law of the sea convention.
and
It's an
by which-
arbitral
by
body.
which body? The arbitral body,
It's the law of the sea. So
It's
the
not the-
Hague and the permanent court arbitration is just the venue.
yeah,
They didn't have standing or
but it's a court of
jurisdiction.
arbitration. It wasn't
It's a-
ITLOS.
It's
It was-
it's an Annex 7 arbitration. It's an
Yeah.
ad hoc arbitration.
Okay, so
The panel of arbitrators was selected by the parties, except China defaulted and they, at any rate.
So what it
It's
does is
just-
it says that there are no islands in the southern part of the South China Sea, right? Obviously Hainan is an island, right? So there's no island, so you can't draw 200 nautical mile EEZs, and you can't, in many cases, you can't even draw 12 nautical miles because it's a low tide elevation.
Yes.
So that was a big ruling because that means that all the waters within the 9-line can't possibly be controlled by any actor, regardless of who owns the rocks and reefs. So that was a big ruling. Another big ruling was mischief reef.
Mhm.
And mischief reef was determined, and this was long before China was powerful. This is what I mean by
Yes.
it not always being a function of power. China grabbed mischief reef and built on it long before it had a strong navy. And yeah, 1995. Now, mischief reef was declared illegal because it was built on a low tide elevation, which has no sovereignty claim within the Filipino EEZ. And you can't build in someone's EEZ without permission. That's a violation. So that one in the Philippines. And the other one was Scarborough Shoal, which was more subtle. Scarborough Shoal yes, Scarborough Shoal is disputed by China and the Philippines. Who owns it? The Chinese sealed off the lagoon, and what the arbitral court said was that regardless of whose it is, it didn't take any position on whose it is. You can't seal the Filipinos out because of their historical practices of fishing,
Artisanal, traditional fishing.
traditional fishing, and
Which
so-
was a very interesting norm that China has
Yeah.
honored in certain ways because they also talk, and I talk about this a lot in chapter 3 or 4. Their artisanal traditional fishing rights down in the
Yeah.
southern part. They have this very non-uniform kind of patchwork way of trying to cobble together, I would argue, ex post rationalizations for the way that they're deploying their maritime forces. So the law ends up it ends up being a really useful descriptive language. I don't think, and this relates to your question too, like it's very difficult to see how this machinery is going to work between the US and China particularly well. I'd like to see it happen. And I think the ways that international law can be effective here, probably, I'd say starting with the Philippines and Vietnam together, or whatever, these different pairings, it does have strength that way. The arbitral ruling, I'm in full agreement with Tom on this. Very, very consequential and will continue to be so, and has created some very fixed sets of interpretations of rules that it's going to be the elephant in the room every time China tries to
Yeah.
negotiate with anyone. Everyone gets to throw that 800-page document on the table and say, why
Why do
would
you
we
just
not,
do
why
this?
would we not start with this as
Yeah.
the basis for our negotiation? This is it.
And it helps with the US-Philippine alliance. It helps with all sorts of things that are important to the
Yes.
United States to have it there. And the US really wasn't behind it. It was my impression was it was a New York law firm with a Filipino lawyer, Singaporean lawyer.
Yeah, Holy Hogue. It's
Yeah.
well, so we spent a lot of time with them too in this process, some of that team. And yeah, the idea that they are working in cahoots with the US government is a little far-fetched because they really think of themselves as Goliath slayers. Their claims to fame is actually they were the ones representing Nicaragua in this famous case where the US withdrew and wouldn't participate in an ICJ procedure.
Yeah.
So they're constantly trying to stick it to the US government.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things about that case, many interesting things, is that the reasons that the US is not in the Law of the Sea Treaty actually evaporated in the course of negotiating. We said we don't like the deep seabed provisions in particular. There needed to be a new treaty instrument. I showed in my pathway. There's one way of doing this. You can add additional instruments. That's one method of change. US engineered that, but then still didn't sign or ratify because our Senate doesn't like treaties. They didn't care about the substance.
Yeah.
But now there's a good substantive reason why we wouldn't join. And I've heard people latch onto this recently. The US, if they were to join the Law of the Sea, would immediately get sued by a Chinese proxy, a Russian proxy, by China or Russia, whatever it is. I agree. I think we should take it.
We should suck it up and take it on the
Right.
chin. and sign
But it's interesting that this now created a real
it
reason.
gets to Wilson's earlier thing. The United States acts like an exceptional power.
Sure.
Go ahead. Wilson.
Last question. For me at least.
Yeah.
If, this is a very hypothetical question. If Russia invades Poland with us, some kind of nuclear war.
Wow.
As long as it doesn't use a balloon, I'll come.
If that happens, that might prompt China to invade Taiwan because America will be engaged with Russia, maybe.
Hmm.
North Korea, they have interest in your missiles now. Might be interested in, doing something to
South Korea.
Iran can be something, which I'm curious that, or Saudi Arabia. Is the United States ready? I mean, we have the Quad working out. I don't know whether they would be ready by the time it happens or.
I'm not quite as apocalyptic. I don't know where Tom comes
Okay.
out on this, but I think one thing that you could say about looking at China's Law of the Sea, and one kind of intuition that I have from it is that this is not a short-term impulsive strategy, nor would any Chinese decision to go to war with Taiwan be just sort of like driven by external events that they didn't control and was, waiting to be an agent of chaos. This is a very long-term deliberate pattern set of choices that I think are designed to incrementally over time achieve what the national security strategy is worried about. Tom, you used exactly the language they use because I'm sure you read it carefully, but it really says tilts the global playing field to its benefit. It's about reshape. It's like creating advantages in the rules for itself. And that's not necessarily what they're doing. That's, of course, I think we had some good discussions on some of the issues with this interpretation, but it's even what the United States is angling against. It's not that China is trying to use this very elaborate kind of process of accretion of its maritime power to just all of a sudden throw everything away in a reckless gamble. So I don't think that I look at this as actually being some part of a contrary basis of evidence of like, well, they're not, if that's what they're planning to do, this is not what they would be doing in advance.
I think you raise a good question in a sense that United States military capacity is massive and global, but it is limited. So if it is tied down somewhere else, it will have less capacity in another region.
Yeah.
But I agree with Isaac that particularly if it was some like a final invasion of Taiwan type of thing, rather than just military pressure or blockade or something like that. My guess is that it's such a complicated and dangerous operation that if China were to launch such a thing, they'd want to do it on their timetable, not on Vladimir Putin's timetable or someone else's timetable. It would take a lot of preparation. And I also think it's an unlikely thing to happen unless there's some political context in which it would happen. Like, I don't think they'll do it simply because they can. I think they will do it if they think they can and they feel like the politics are such that this is the time to get this problem over with. Like something has been done to jab them in the eye or something like that. And now it's time to just get this problem over with and we can finally do it.
I was thinking what Blinken was talking about China trying to do Russia arms yesterday. I think it was yesterday.
Yeah, no, that's in the news now. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a big problem. But this is something, unfortunately, that I wrote about last year that I was worried about after the invasion of Ukraine, that Xi Jinping has a big stake in Vladimir Putin's domestic survival. And Russia's doing very poorly in the war. And I don't think China wanted the war as we see it. I think it was a disaster for China, but China doesn't want Putin to lose the war and potentially lose power. So I worried last year, because China at that time was not apparently transferring anything useful to Russia, that would change over time if Russia continued to do poorly. And unfortunately, the newspapers this week suggest that the US government believes it's happening. And that will cause huge rifts between the United States and China. That'll be a much bigger rift than we've seen to date over trade and other things. That will be big, because then it'll really look like two blocks squaring off over Ukraine in a way that starts to look like a Cold War. I published a few articles, Wilson, about why there's not going to be a new US-Soviet style Cold War between the US and the PRC, and I firmly believed in it at the time. And then last summer, I wrote a paper calling into question my earlier arguments, because Russia invaded Ukraine, which I think changed a lot in the geopolitics. It made NATO a much tighter organization. It made democracy versus authoritarianism a much more salient feature of international politics. And I think, unfortunately, for not only the United States, but for China itself, I believe that Putin tricked Xi Jinping at the Olympics with this big statement and this big, we're best friends. And then he went and tried to drive on a sovereign capital. And Xi has been unable to distance himself from him. And so it's unfortunate. I think it's bad for everyone, but that's just me.
I think it really offends some basic Chinese sensibility about how you're supposed to do this. Again, back to the point about how do they approach their maritime disputes. There was a very unfortunate conflation of China and Russia under the last administration, as though they had the same interests and resources to do it. But we look at China, let's use this in a non-normative way. China's a constructive agenda. They're trying to do something. They have positive goals in the maritime space as well as elsewhere. Yes, you could say Russia wants to seize Ukrainian territory or something, but the idea that this is the sort of thing that China likes to see in international politics, I think, is a little far-fetched. It's just it's reckless and creates uncertainty in the international space, and it weakens their most important allied partner over time.
Yeah,
maybe fatally.
Yeah, Russia's much weaker today than it was before the invasion, and that was China.
Significantly.
Why is that good for? That's not good for China either. So I don't see anything really good for China coming out of it.
It's like
But the food's here. Let's eat.
what do we do?
So we clap. Thank
Okay.
you, Isaac.
Thank you, Tom. This is really true.
Now we get to eat.
Good. Thanks for hosting.
Or chinko.
Shit,
Real
yeah.
food can.
It's great to be back at